Northrend, unlike Kalimdor, was not a forgotten or undiscovered continent by the humans by the time of the events of Warcraft 3. And I don't mean in terms of legends and hearsay, again like Kalimdor was remembered at the time. Rather, it was a land actually populated, albeit sparsely, by humans, presumably from Lordaeron. There's no direct indication one way or another that those humans of Northrend were from Lordaeron, rather it's just an educated guess based on certain facts and on an event in the Warcraft 3 human campaign. Namely, when Turnus sends an emissary to Arthas' forces in Northrend to recall them home, which would imply that Lordaeron had at least a basic understanding of the lay of the land. Arthas, for instance, could have just been blinded by his quest for retribution and sailed completely blindly. Now, all in all, there are 4 human settlements and societies that we can talk about. One of them certainly predates the Third War and the arrival of the Lich King. The second probably does as well. The third, probably 90% also predates it, while the fourth is a much more questionable case. Let's go in order of confirmation of likelihood. The first and absolutely certain one is a human settlement, of which we don't know the name, located in Dragonblight. They were the very first humans to be corrupted by the Lich King, as he infected them with the plague using his magical power alone and turned them into undead. Presumably this settlement was wiped out by the plague, since pretty much no trace of it remains in game. Next is Winterguard Village, also in Dragonblight. Not much is known about the history of this village, and you could make an argument that it and the settlement I talked about before were one and the same. However, it was still inhabited by the time the Alliance expedition in Wrath of the Lich King showed up and constructed Winterguard Keep in the nearby hills. How do we know then that Winterguard Village predates the Alliance expedition and wasn't just built as an extension of the keep? Well, because of the quest A Righteous Sermon, where you and an Alliance Inquisitor interrogate the ghoulified mayor of that village. For one, during that quest you learn that there is a mausoleum built by humans, which the Alliance had no idea about, beneath the village. Also, the fact that the Inquisitor calls Winterguard Village the Old Village. Next, and I think the greatest piece of evidence that this settlement predates the coming of the Lich King, is the fact that a Scourge Lich went into the mausoleum to resurrect thousands of corpses, which almost certainly would have been buried there over a very long period of time, given that Winterguard Village was, well, a village, not a major city. Other than that though, not much else is known about Winterguard Village. The next are the Trappers of Grizzly Hills. They were already there and had an established culture by the time the Alliance showed up during Wrath of the Lich King. These were probably originally a colony of Lordaeron, or at least one of the human nations in Lordaeron, since they treat the humans of Stormwind as foreigners. As you can tell by their name, they mostly survive by trapping, aka hunting and skinning, and also logging, and it's also been stated that they practice some agriculture. Most of them, however, became members of the Wolf Cult, were turned into Worgen by Arago after the agents of the Lich King resurrected him, and thus became members of the Scourge. Their settlements are fairly scattered throughout Grizzly Hills, though judging by the similarities in style, I'd venture to guess that they made most of the road markers in the zone. This is once again just an educated guess, but I'd venture to presume that before the Venture Company and later the Alliance and Horde took it over, Venture Bay also belonged to the Trappers, and I imagine would have been the original site of their original colony. The buildings are not built in their style, but in a more traditional human style, the kind you'd find in Stormwind, Lordaeron, etc. But it's definitely not the style the Venture Company would build in. And while a colony does need a port to connect it to its motherland, otherwise they would have practically stranded themselves in the new land. Now, there is one point of contention regarding the Grizzly Hills Trappers. This is why I said I'm only 90% certain they predate the Lich King and not entirely so. Namely, Wikipedia states that the very old sources before Wrath of the Lich King, the Warcraft 3 manual and the in-game book Ice Crown and the Frozen Throne, state that the Lich King, before he began the plague in Lordaeron, corrupted all the humans of Northrend into undead. But all those sources actually say that a remote human settlement on the fringes of the vast Dragonblight was affected, and not more. Also, the existence of Winterguard Village is a point against that argument. I also don't think it really makes sense that the Grizzly Hills trappers arrived sometime after Lordaeron fell, but before the events of Wrath of the Lich King. For one, they have a fairly distinct culture and a well-established society that I don't think they could have built in just 6 years. Also, before the Alliance and Horde invaded in Wrath of the Lich King, Northrend would have been a fairly poor choice to establish a brand new colony, since it was well known as being under the general domain of the Lich King. And again, since they didn't come from Stormwind, if they did arrive in that 6-year interval, they would have probably either come from Kul Tiras, not impossible I guess, or Gilneas, though it seems odd that they would willingly join the Worgen Wolf cult in that case then. Again, this is just my reasoning, and the possibility that they came in that 6-year interval is still there. The last and least likely human colony is Valgard in Howling Fjord. Now, Valgard as a possible human colony is not because of a direct stated piece of lore, rather because of the succession of retcons. Let's explain in order. Originally, when Arthas arrived in Northrend with his forces, the Warcraft 3 maps depicted him as arriving in Daggercap Bay, logically around where Valgard is in present time. Later, the RPG books, which are now non-canon, but were still canon when Wrath of the Lich King came out, depicted Valgard as a human Alliance settlement active in Northrend long before the Alliance expedition of Wrath came there. That would imply that Valgard was either built before Arthas arrived there, unlikely given that the Warcraft 3 missions had Arthas arriving in almost barren wasteland, or that Valgard was the remains of Arthas' expedition, the ones who were not turned into undead. Again, I know the RPG books have been retconned, but I'm just going in order of the information we got. And Valgard was also present on some very early World of Warcraft maps. Then Wrath of the Lich King came out and Arthas' route was retconned. Instead of arriving in Daggercap Bay in Howling Fjord, the fleet arrived on the southeast coast of Dragonblight at the place called the Forgotten Shore. You can see its physical remains there, and there are even quests to interact with the ghosts. With this in mind, given the fact that the RPG books were still canon at the time, logically speaking, it means that Valgard was built separately from Arthas' arrival, probably before the Lich King came to being. However, then the RPG books were retconned, leaving Valgard's status as ambiguous. More likely, it was built by the Alliance expedition in Wrath of the Lich King, but its complicated history means it's entirely up for debate and personal interpretation. Then Chronicle 3 stated that Arthas arrived in Howling Fjord, so maybe Arthas' forces built it, again up to interpretation. So these are the human settlements of Northrend before the Lich King showed up. An unknown settlement in Dragonblight, Winterguard Village, which is probably not the same place, then probably the Grizzly Hills trappers, and finally, though probably not, Valgard in Howling Fjord. Alright, thank you all very much for watching and listening to me, and I'll see you all later. Farewell.